Today is May 18th, 2026. Talks to end the U.S.-Iran war are officially still alive, but tonight the message from Washington is brutally simple. The clock is ticking. U.S. President Donald Trump just went on Truth Social and wrote, "They better get moving, fast, or there won't be anything left of them. Time is of the essence." On the surface, that sounds like one more angry post from a president who likes to talk tough. In reality, it is a public countdown layered on top of a war, a blocked energy choke point, and a set of demands that neither side seems ready to swallow. Right now, Iran is still controlling the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow strip of water off its southern coast that normally carries around 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. The United States, for its part, is still enforcing a blockade of Iranian ships and ports to squeeze Tehran back to the table on Washington's terms. So when Trump says time is of the essence, he's not just talking about negotiators in a quiet room. He's talking about tankers changing course, oil markets on edge, and governments from Asia to Europe trying to figure out how long they can live with a frozen ceasefire that hasn't really ended the war. I'm Bob Thompson, and this is Wartech Global, where we break down wars, weapons, and the power plays reshaping our world. To understand how dangerous this moment really is, we have to start with the official story and then peel it back. On paper, the ceasefire announced in early April did exactly what it was supposed to do. It halted the massive wave of U.S. and Israeli airstrikes that began on 28 February. It reduced the intensity of direct fighting. It created space for diplomats to meet in places like Islamabad. The White House called it a chance to work toward a very close peace deal. Iranian officials publicly welcomed mediation efforts led by Pakistan's military and political leadership. But look at what has not changed since then. Iranian-aligned forces in Lebanon have still been under Israeli fire. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz again if the U.S. blockade continues, and has shown it is willing to restrict or reclose the waterway when it feels the ceasefire terms have been violated. Trump has kept the American blockade on Iranian ships and ports in full force, even on days when the strait was temporarily reopened. In other words, the guns have gone quieter, but the pressure has not gone away. This is not peace. It's a pause, and it's a pause being used as a tool. That's the backdrop for Trump's latest warning, and this message fits into a pattern. Just before the ceasefire was announced, he warned that a whole civilization would die if Iran refused to agree to a deal to end the war. When Iran briefly reopened the Strait of Hormuz in April, he immediately said the American blockade on Iranian ships would stay in place until Tehran agreed to hand over its enriched uranium and accept his terms. Earlier this month, he said the truce was on massive life support after rejecting Tehran's demands as totally unacceptable. Now, with clock is ticking and nothing left of them, he has turned vague frustration into something much closer to an ultimatum. But what is actually on the table in these talks? Let's strip away the slogans and look at what each side says it wants. On the Iranian side, semi-official outlets like Mehr, Tasnim, and Fars are painting a picture of an offer they describe as responsible and generous. According to their reporting, Tehran's latest proposal includes several key points. First, an immediate end to the war on all fronts, not just direct U.S.-Iran fighting, but also an end to Israeli attacks against Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon. Second, a halt to the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports and ships. Third, guarantees of no further attacks on Iranian territory. Fourth, compensation for war damage. And fifth, an emphasis on Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, a demand that effectively asks the world to acknowledge that this narrow but vital waterway off Iran's coast is not simply an open highway Washington can police at will. If you stand in Tehran's shoes for a moment, this list can be sold as basic security. Your ports are being blockaded, your allies are being hit, your territory has been under air attack. Your government tells its people, "We are not asking for luxury, we are asking for survival. Stop bombing us, stop strangling our economy, respect our right to control the waters on our doorstep, and pay something for the damage you've already done. Now flip the map. If you're sitting in Washington or Tel Aviv or in a Gulf capital that has watched its trade and energy shipments disrupted by Iran's moves in Hormuz, that same list looks very different. It looks like Tehran saying, end pressure on us and our partners, drop your main tools of leverage, accept our ongoing control over the world's most important energy choke point, and compensate us on top of it. For many U.S. and allied officials, that doesn't sound like compromise. It sounds like Iran trying to turn a costly war into a long-term strategic upgrade. On the U.S. side, Iranian media report that Washington has responded with 5 conditions of its own. 2 of them jump off the page. First, that Iran should be allowed to operate only a single nuclear facility. Second, that its stockpile of highly enriched uranium should be transferred out of the country, reportedly to U.S. custody. On top of that, Trump has suggested in public that instead of a permanent end to Iran's nuclear program, he could accept a 20-year suspension, which marks a shift away from his earlier demand for total dismantlement. From a U.S. point of view, this is presented as a tough but realistic nuclear bargain. Iran would keep a small, heavily monitored civilian use program. The most dangerous material would leave the country, and the world would get at least 2 decades of breathing room before any new crisis over Iranian enrichment. For politicians in Washington, that can be sold as a win. Iran is contained, the threat is delayed, and any cheating would be easier to detect. From Tehran's perspective, it can look like something very different. You just went through a war with the world's most powerful military. You watched U.S. and Israeli strikes hit your territory, but you also demonstrated that you could close or restrict the Strait of Hormuz and send global markets into a panic. You saw Pakistan and other mediators fly in because they needed you at the table. Now your opponent is telling you, keep only 1 nuclear site, ship your most sensitive material to the very country you've called your main enemy, and trust that in 20 years the next generation of American politicians will still honor whatever deal you sign today. If your political identity is built on resistance and independence, that is not an easy offer to accept. This clash of demands is why talks keep stalling. It is not just that a few paragraphs need to be rewritten. It's that the basic story each side tells at home does not match the other's version of reality. In Iran's story, they stood firm, weathered sanctions and strikes, held the world's energy choke point in their hands, and now deserve security guarantees, recognition, and relief. In Washington's story, the U.S. and its allies hit Iran hard, brought it to the edge of defeat, forced it into accepting a ceasefire, and can now demand strict limits on its nuclear program and regional influence. Put simply, both sides think they've already paid for the right to win. If this were only about pride and paper, it would already be dangerous. But it's more than that. The negotiation is wired directly into geography, and into a single strip of water you can draw with a pen, but feel every time you fill your tank. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those rare geographic features that acts like a global switch. In normal times, nearly a fifth of the world's oil and a similar share of liquefied natural gas passes through this narrow channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Tankers line up in lanes, navies escort and monitor. Ports from Saudi Arabia to Qatar, the UAE, and Iraq rely on it as their exit to global markets. When that flow is smooth, most people don't even think about the strait. When it is threatened, everyone does. Since the war escalated, Iran has repeatedly used Hormuz as leverage, restricting traffic, threatening to close it if the blockade continues, and in some periods reclosing it after briefly reopening it. Iranian officials frame this as a proportional response. If the U.S. keeps choking Iranian ports, Iran will not keep the main artery of global energy fully open. From Tehran's point of view, this is the one piece of pressure that actually gets Washington's attention. On the other side, the U.S.-led blockade on Iranian ships and ports is designed to cut off Tehran's ability to export and import at scale. Crude oil, petrochemicals, industrial parts, food, and consumer goods. It's meant to starve the war effort and weaken the regime's grip at home. Trump has been blunt. He has said the blockade will stay in place until Iran reaches a deal with the U.S., including on its nuclear program. So we have two kinds of pressure pointing at each other. Iran is squeezing the world's energy flow. The U.S. is squeezing Iran's economy. Every extra day this continues sends a quiet bill out into the global system. If you're watching from the U.S., Europe, or Asia and wondering whether any of this really hits you, here's how the chain works. When Hormuz is risky, ships pay more for insurance. Some avoid the route altogether. When Iranian ports are blocked, buyers have fewer options for crude and refined products. Those higher costs show up in futures prices, refinery margins, and shipping rates. A few months later, they show up in the price on the pump and at the supermarket because fuel is embedded in everything that moves: food, building materials, electronics, you name it. That's why Trump's line about the clock matters for more than Tehran. Time is not free for Washington either. Every week that oil markets have to price in the chance of a renewed closure of Hormuz, and every week that companies have to factor in a continuing blockade of a large regional economy, adds friction and uncertainty. Markets can live with bad news. They struggle with unpredictable news. Now add the political layer. Trump is not just talking to Iran when he writes "clock is ticking, and there won't be anything left of them." He's talking to his base at home, who expect him to be tough. He's talking to Israel, whose leadership has signaled readiness for renewed fighting if talks fail. He's talking to Gulf partners who rely on U.S. security guarantees. And he's talking to political rivals who will accuse him of weakness if he accepts a deal that looks soft, or of recklessness if he lets the war flare up again. Iran's leaders are doing the same thing in reverse. Foreign ministry spokespeople and semi-official outlets are saying the U.S. has failed to make any concrete concessions and is pushing the talks toward an impasse. They insist their proposals are responsible and generous, and that the problem lies in Washington's lack of compromise. Inside Iran, where people have endured years of sanctions, protests, and now war, the regime has to show it is not bowing to American pressure, even if the economic cost of holding out keeps rising. In the middle, trying to keep something like a path to peace alive, is Pakistan. Islamabad, and particularly Pakistan's army chief, Asim Munir, has become a key mediator, shuttling between Washington and Tehran to extend and revive the ceasefire. Pakistan has strong ties to both countries and deep stakes in avoiding a wider regional war, but it doesn't have the power to erase either side's red lines. It can smooth misunderstandings, propose formulas, and offer its capital as neutral ground. It cannot force the U.S. to drop its nuclear demands or Iran to give up control over Hormuz. That's why, even with Pakistani mediation, reports keep using the same words: talks stalled, peace progress stalls, no deal. The reality is that all the goodwill in the room can't fix a structural problem. Two sides who both think time is on their side and who both think the other will crack first. So where does this go from here? There are three realistic paths, and all of them carry risk. The first is a face-saving pause. In this path, both sides quietly accept that they will not get the perfect deal they've been selling to their people. Iran might agree to cap enrichment at a lower level, accept intrusive inspections at a limited number of facilities, and clarify that it will not close Hormuz as long as its ships and ports are not being strangled. The U.S. might accept that Iran will keep some nuclear infrastructure, drop the idea of physically taking possession of all enriched uranium, and endorse a monitored international storage arrangement instead. Each side would talk loudly about what it won, not about what it gave up. If that happens, the global system breathes. Oil prices drift down from crisis highs. Shipping routes normalize. Insurance rates come off their peaks. For an average family in Ohio, Texas, or California, that looks like gas prices slowly easing and grocery bills stabilizing instead of jumping every few weeks. Your 401k stops swinging like a roller coaster. Your sense of background anxiety drops a few notches. The second path is that the clock really does run out. Negotiations hit an impasse that no one can spin away. Iranian outlets keep saying the U.S. is refusing to compromise. U.S. officials keep calling Iran's demands totally unacceptable. At some point, Trump decides that looking weak is worse than risking escalation. He orders a new round of strikes, perhaps targeted at Iranian infrastructure, missile sites, naval bases, bridges, power plants, along the lines of his earlier threat that Iran can be taken out in one night, returned to the Stone Ages. Iran responds with missiles or drones of its own, maybe at Gulf infrastructure or U.S. bases, and tightens its grip on Hormuz even further. In that world, the economic shock is not a slow burn. It's a jolt. Oil prices spike sharply. Stock markets drop on fears of a wider war. Insurance on ships through the Gulf becomes so expensive that some traffic stops altogether. For ordinary people, this means sharp, visible change. Long lines at gas stations in some countries, sudden jumps in energy bills, and a new wave of headlines about recession risk. The third path is the one nobody likes to think about because it doesn't have a clear beginning or end: permanent pressure. In this scenario, there is no dramatic explosion or clean resolution. The ceasefire remains in name, but the underlying confrontation becomes a semi-permanent feature of the international system. Iran keeps using Hormuz as a pressure lever, not closing it fully, but never letting it be truly safe. The U.S. keeps some form of port and shipping blockade, turning trade and finance into long-term tools of war. Talks continue off and on, but they are always on the brink, never fully successful. For the global economy, this is like a chronic illness, not lethal in one blow, but constantly wearing down resilience. Energy stays more expensive than it would otherwise be. Shipping remains more complicated. Investors always have to factor in the risk of a sudden spark in the Gulf when they decide where to put their money. For average households, that shows up as a world where prices rarely go back to the way things used to be, and where shocks from faraway crises show up in your bills faster and more often. There are two big misconceptions that make all of this even more dangerous. The first is the comforting idea that the U.S. has everything under control, that American military strength, economic weight, and alliances mean Washington can force any outcome it wants, whenever it wants. There is no question that the U.S. remains the most powerful actor in this conflict. But power does not automatically translate into clean, cost-free solutions. Even a highly successful strike campaign against Iran's infrastructure would not guarantee that Hormuz stays open, that Iran's proxies stay quiet, or that markets stay calm. It would guarantee escalation. Beyond that, it becomes a gamble not just with military lives, but with the stability of the global economy. The second misconception is that as long as missiles are not falling on Western cities, this is essentially someone else's war. In a globalized energy system, there is no such thing as a purely local war in the Strait of Hormuz. When nearly a fifth of the world's oil and gas moves through one narrow channel, any conflict there is everyone's problem. You may never see a ship, a mine, or a jet in the Gulf in person, but you will see the effects in the numbers on your receipts, the volatility of your retirement account, and the level of stress in the global economy. So tonight, as Trump warns that the clock is ticking, and Iranian officials warn of an impasse if Washington does not move, we are watching more than just a diplomatic drama. We are watching a test of how far a regional war can be pushed into the global system before something breaks, and of whether political leaders on both sides understand that the longer they use time as a weapon, the more they force ordinary people to pay the price. The hard question is simple, but uncomfortable. Do you think this strategy of pressure, blockades, and ultimatums is actually making America and the wider world safer? Or is it quietly building a more dangerous and more expensive future for people who have no say at the negotiating table? If you want to follow how standoffs like this one show up in your gas prices, your savings, and your sense of security, make sure you're subscribed to Wartech Global and have notifications on, so you're here for the next chapter in this story. I'm Bob Thompson, and this is Wartech Global, where we break down wars, weapons, and the power plays reshaping our world.